November 19th, 2003. A quiet town in North Carolina. Michael Torres, 35 years old, was a respected boxing coach. Known across the local gyms, he pushed his students hard and built a reputation for discipline and results. That night, after a long day of training, he walked out of his gym for the last time. At 10:15 p.m., a grainy camera caught him leaving the building, a duffel bag slung over his shoulder. His last words to a student still ring. "Tomorrow I'll have big news." He never made it home. Hours later, his car was found abandoned in a dirt lot 3 miles from the gym. The keys were still in the ignition. The driver's seat had been pushed far back, as if someone taller had been behind the wheel. His duffel bag and boxing gloves were gone, and on the passenger side, a worn leather wallet lay on the seat with only a few crumpled bills inside. Michael's sudden disappearance shocked everyone who knew him. He wasn't just a coach. He was a fixture in the community, a man whose life revolved around training, discipline, and helping young fighters stay off the streets. To vanish without warning was unthinkable. What happened in the hours between the gym and that empty lot? Why would his car be left in such a strange state? And what secret did Michael mean when he told his student there was big news coming the next day? This was not just a man who vanished. This was the start of a case that would raise questions about debts, rivalries, and trust. Stay with us, because the first detail about Michael's life and the people around him may completely change how you see this disappearance. Michael Torres was 35 years old when he vanished. He lived in Raleigh, North Carolina, in a modest apartment, not far from the gym that defined his life. For most people in the neighborhood, Michael wasn't just a coach. He was the man who kept kids off the streets, the one who turned restless energy into discipline and routine. But behind that role, his life was more complicated than it appeared. Michael's story began in the boxing ring. As a young fighter in the late 1990s, he had shown promise. He had the skill, the speed, the discipline. People thought he might go far. But in 1997, a serious injury ended that dream. His career in the ring was over, almost as soon as it had begun. For many, that would have been the end of the story. For Michael, it became the start of a new one. Unable to fight, he turned to training. He poured his time, his energy, and what little money he had into opening a small boxing gym. It wasn't fancy. The bags were worn, the ring was secondhand, and the walls were cracked. But it became a place of hope. Local families sent their kids there to learn more than just how to throw a punch. They learned focus, discipline, and respect. Michael's students described him in the same way: tough, strict, demanding, but always fair. He pushed them hard, but he believed in them. And for many of those kids, winning in the ring meant staying away from gangs, from drugs, from the wrong kind of friends. Over the years, several of his fighters went on to compete in regional tournaments. To them, Michael was more than a trainer. He was a mentor, and sometimes even a father figure. But Michael's strong personality cut both ways. He wasn't the type to hold back when he had an opinion. That blunt honesty created friction. Some fighters clashed with him. Other trainers in the area saw him as arrogant. And even in his own gym, arguments sometimes boiled over. To Michael, it was part of the job. To others, it was fuel for grudges that would last for years. Outside the gym, life was harder. Running a boxing facility in a small town didn't bring in much money. Membership fees barely covered the rent, Equipment repairs came out of his pocket. To keep the doors open, Michael sometimes borrowed money, not just from banks or friends, but from sources that operated in the shadows. By the early 2000s, whispers spread that he owed money to people tied to underground gambling. This debt became a shadow that followed him everywhere. Some said he borrowed to pay bills. Others said he owed money after betting himself. Whatever the truth, it connected him to dangerous circles. Circles that didn't forgive late payments. His personal life wasn't much better. Michael had been married once, but the relationship ended years earlier. After the divorce, he lived alone, with no children and few close friends. He spent most of his time at the gym or at the small coffee shops and bars nearby. That was where people in the community saw him, either alone or meeting with acquaintances. And sometimes those acquaintances weren't the kind of people a coach wanted to be seen with. Still, in public, Michael stuck to his role as a coach. He told his students that boxing was the only way to fight your way out of trouble. For the kids who trained with him, that line became a motto. They repeated it like a mantra, long after he was gone. Whether those rumors were true or not, what's clear is that Michael was living a life under pressure. He was respected and admired by many, but also resented by others. He had friends, but also enemies. And he was holding on to secrets that only a few people may have known. On the surface, Michael Torres was the coach who demanded push-ups, who yelled at fighters to keep their guard up, who believed discipline could save a young life. But behind closed doors, he was a man in debt, a man connected to dangerous figures, and perhaps a man preparing for a confrontation he couldn't avoid. In November of 2003, that tension came to a breaking point. Days before his disappearance, Michael hinted to one of his students that something big was about to change. He told them, "Tomorrow I'll have good news." It was a line that became haunting after he vanished. What news was he talking about? Was it about money, about his gym, or about the people he owed? No one ever got the answer. Instead, what followed was a night that ended with a car abandoned, a gym without a leader, and a mystery that has lasted for years. Michael's life was complicated. It was a balance between helping kids and fighting battles of his own. And as investigators would soon discover, the final days of his life carried signs that he was hiding more than anyone realized. The man who taught others to fight may have been caught in a fight of his own, one that would end not in the ring, but in silence. Stay with us, because the next part will take you through the last day anyone saw Michael alive, and the physical evidence that turned his disappearance into a cold case. November 19th, 2003. For most of the day, Michael Torres followed his routine. In the morning, he taught a class of teenagers at his small gym in Raleigh. Several students later told investigators that he seemed normal. He joked, corrected their stances, and even stayed behind to give advice to one boy who wanted to compete. Nothing in his behavior suggested what would happen later. Around midday, Michael was spotted at a cafe a few blocks from the gym. Witnesses remembered him sitting across from an unidentified man. They talked for almost 30 minutes. Normally, Michael drove the short 3-kilometer route back to his apartment, but he never made it home. By dawn, his car had been discovered in a dirt lot about the same distance away from the gym, but in the opposite direction. The vehicle itself raised more questions than it answered. The engine was off, the driver's side door unlocked, and the key still in the ignition. Most unusual was the driver's seat. It had been pushed all the way back, set for someone taller than Michael's 5'9" frame. Investigators immediately considered that someone else had been in control of the car. Inside, several of Michael's belongings were missing. His backpack, boxing gloves, and personal documents were gone. What remained was a worn leather wallet lying near the passenger seat. It contained only a few coins, no credit cards, no identification. The detail suggested the wallet was left behind on purpose, not forgotten. Forensics examined the car carefully. There were no clear fingerprints on the door handles. Tire tracks nearby suggested another vehicle had pulled in and out of the lot during the night. A neighbor living close to the area later reported hearing a car pull up around midnight, but when they looked out the window they saw nothing unusual and went back inside. The abandoned car marked the first solid clue in Michael's disappearance. It didn't point to a straightforward robbery. Nothing valuable had been taken. Instead, it hinted at staging, as if someone wanted to create confusion. Investigators began to suspect that the car itself had been moved and left in that lot deliberately, designed to send them in the wrong direction. The discovery raised new questions. Who was the unknown man at the cafe? Why would one of Michael's closest students be linked to DNA later recovered from inside the car? And what secret was Michael carrying when he told a student the night before, "Tomorrow, I'll have big news"? The investigation was no longer about a man who failed to return home. The car transformed the case. It showed that Michael's disappearance wasn't random. Someone had taken steps to cover their tracks. Someone knew exactly what they were doing. And that detail, the seat pushed too far. The keys were still in the ignition, untouched, as if the car had been left in a hurry. But nothing else inside pointed to panic. No broken glass, no signs of a struggle, no blood. The vehicle looked staged, carefully abandoned, as if someone wanted it to be found exactly where it was. Forensic teams swabbed the steering wheel, gearshift, and driver's seat. They also checked the door handles and dashboard for touch DNA. The results came back within days, and they stunned investigators. Among the prints and skin cells left behind was a clear match, one of Michael's closest students. This wasn't just another trainee. This was a young man Michael had taken under his wing, training him for a regional amateur boxing competition. He had been in Michael's circle for years. When confronted, the student didn't deny that his DNA could be in the car. Instead, he gave a simple explanation. He claimed Michael had once allowed him to borrow the sedan a few days before the disappearance. He said he only drove it briefly, just around the neighborhood, and that was why his DNA was there. But investigators weren't satisfied. No one, not a single friend or fellow trainee, had ever seen Michael hand over the car. It wasn't his style. Michael was protective of his belongings, especially his vehicle, which was one of the few valuable things he owned. The more police pressed, the more the story seemed to fall apart. The timeline didn't fit. The student insisted he hadn't been near Michael or the car on the night of November 19th. But the DNA suggested otherwise. And the odd position of the driver's seat pointed to someone who wasn't Michael driving last. If Michael had walked away, why would he adjust the seat for someone else? And if he had lent the car earlier in the week, why was it abandoned in a dirt lot with the keys still inside? Another strange detail stood out. Michael's gym bag and gloves, which he was seen carrying when he left the boxing gym, were missing. They weren't in the car. They weren't found nearby. If Michael had simply gone somewhere on his own, he would have taken the bag with him. If he had been forced out, the bag should have been left behind. Instead, it vanished with him. Witness statements added more confusion. One man who lived near the dirt lot told police he heard a car pull in around midnight. He said the engine idled for a moment before shutting off. He didn't see anyone leave the vehicle. When he looked outside later, the car was still there, sitting quietly in the dark. That testimony placed the car's arrival several hours after Michael was last seen leaving the gym. If true, it meant someone else drove the sedan to that location long after Michael had already disappeared. The possibility of staging became stronger. The DNA pointed to someone close to Michael. The car placement didn't make sense. The missing gym bag and missing ID felt intentional. Step by step, the investigation leaned away from a random attack and toward something personal, maybe even connected to money. Michael had debts. He had enemies. And now, one of his own students, someone he trusted, was tied directly to the last thing he left behind. For detectives, this was a turning point. The abandoned car was no longer just a discarded lead. It was a controlled scene. Someone wanted it found. Someone wanted Michael's trail to end there. But instead of shutting the case down, the car opened a new path. The question became simple. If Michael didn't drive his own car to that lot, then who did? And why leave it there in the middle of the night, with the keys still dangling in the ignition? This discovery raised the stakes. Investigators now had to decide whether the student was lying to protect himself, or if he had been pulled into something much bigger, something that connected Michael's debts, his enemies, and the dangerous world of illegal betting that seemed to surround his gym. The abandoned car, silent and still in that dirt lot, carried more weight than any confession. It held physical proof that someone close to Michael had been there. And if that was true, then Michael's disappearance was not just about rivalry or anger. It was about money, loyalty, and betrayal. The car forced investigators to shift focus. Michael's fate might not have been sealed inside that vehicle. Daniel Ross was 22 years old in 2003. He had once been one of Michael Torres's most promising students, strong, ambitious, and known for his aggressive style in the ring. Daniel had dreams of going professional. For a while, it looked possible. Coaches from other gyms came to watch him fight. He won several amateur bouts. People in Raleigh thought he could be the next fighter to break out of North Carolina. But in 2002, everything collapsed. During a regional tournament, Daniel tested positive for performance-enhancing drugs. The person who reported it was Michael himself. As head coach, Michael had a duty to protect the sport and his gym's reputation. Daniel was disqualified, his record stripped, and his chance at a professional career effectively ended. Daniel never forgave him. Friends told investigators that Daniel felt betrayed. To him, Michael was not just a coach. He was supposed to be a mentor, a protector. Instead, Daniel claimed Michael destroyed my future with one phone call. The bitterness festered. Over the next year, Daniel stopped training seriously, drifted between jobs, and spent more nights drinking than boxing. Several people recalled hearing Daniel lash out at Michael. One sparring partner remembered him saying, "He's gonna pay for what he did to me." Another gym member described a heated argument just weeks before Michael's disappearance. The shouting was so loud that other trainees stopped mid-session to watch. No punches were thrown that night, but the animosity was clear. On the evening of November 19th, the night Michael was last seen, Daniel was spotted at a bar less than a mile from the vacant lot where Michael's car was found. A bartender confirmed he was drinking heavily, slamming glasses, muttering angrily. At around 11 o'clock, a witness claimed they saw Daniel step outside the bar, put on a gray hooded jacket, and head in the direction of the lot. When questioned, Daniel denied being anywhere near the area. He told detectives he had spent the entire night at a friend's house. But when officers tracked down the friend, the alibi fell apart. The friend told them Daniel had not been there that night, not once. Adding to the suspicion, Daniel's cell phone was switched off for more than 2 hours between 10:30 p.m. and 12:30 a.m., exactly the window when Michael vanished. Investigators pressed him on why his phone had gone dark, but Daniel had no clear answer. He shrugged it off, claiming the battery had died. Detectives found that explanation unconvincing. There was also surveillance footage from a traffic camera positioned along a nearby road. The quality was poor, the image grainy, but investigators believed it showed a man walking alone near the vacant lot close to midnight. The figure was wearing a jacket with the hood pulled up. He moved quickly, shoulders hunched, head low. While the image could not positively identify Daniel, the build and clothing were consistent with what witnesses said he wore that night. To investigators, the pieces began to line up. Motive: Michael had humiliated Daniel publicly and cost him his career. Opportunity: Daniel had been drinking just blocks away from where the car was abandoned. Alibi: weak, even contradicted. And behavior: his phone conveniently off during the crucial hours. Police interviewed Daniel multiple times. Each time he grew more defensive. He admitted to drinking that night but denied going near the lot. He insisted he would never harm Michael. He was like a father to me, he claimed, even as his anger toward Michael's decision in 2002 was well known. Detectives felt the words rang hollow. Still, there were problems. For all the suspicion, there was no direct evidence placing Daniel in some. The media picked up on his name early, painting Daniel as the angry ex-fighter who might have taken revenge on his old coach. Some of Michael's other students believed it. They told reporters, nobody hated Coach Torres more than Daniel. But others defended him, saying he had been lost and angry, but not a killer. One small but nagging detail kept investigators uncertain. If Daniel had harmed Michael, why leave the car in such a visible place, with the keys still inside? Detectives considered the possibility that the scene had been staged, to frame Daniel, or to confuse the timeline. Was Daniel careless, or was someone else deliberately pointing the finger at him? As weeks passed, Daniel remained a top suspect, but no charges were filed. He continued to deny involvement, though he stopped coming to the gym and eventually left town. Some believe the pressure and whispers drove him away. Others think his departure was a quiet admission of guilt. In the end, Daniel Ross embodied everything investigators feared in the case: a young man with motive, opportunity, and anger burning inside him. Yet without solid evidence, his role in Michael's disappearance remains uncertain. The question still lingers: was Daniel's presence near the vacant lot a coincidence? Or was it the final step in a grudge that had festered for over a year? And if Daniel had the motive of revenge, the next suspect had something even more dangerous: money and power. Victor Malone was 45 years old in 2003. In Raleigh, North Carolina, his name carried weight. He was not a public figure, not a businessman you'd read about in the local paper, but everyone in town knew who he was. He ran an underground casino, a place where cash moved quickly, debts piled up, and threats were handed out as easily as drinks at the bar. Malone wasn't just a gambler. He was a man who controlled a network of illegal betting that tied into organized crime. Michael Torres had crossed into Malone's world. Running a small gym doesn't pay much, and Michael's bills piled up. He wanted to keep the doors open, to give kids a place to box instead of spending nights on them. A witness added more fuel. A bartender recalled seeing Michael and Malone in the same parking lot behind a bar just weeks before the disappearance. They weren't laughing, weren't catching up as friends. The bartender described Michael as tense, his hands moving in sharp gestures. Malone stood still, listening, then leaning in close. Whatever was said in that exchange, it wasn't casual. Police later obtained a small black ledger seized during a raid on one of Malone's operations. Inside, names and initials were written next to dollar figures. One line carried the letters MT and a number that lined up with the kind of loan Michael was rumored to have taken. For investigators, it looked like a debt trail written in plain ink. When detectives questioned Malone, he didn't flinch. He said he was nowhere near Michael the night of November 19th. He claimed he was hosting a private party at an apartment across town. Several guests confirmed he was there, but their statements didn't quite match. Some said he left around midnight. Others swore he was gone by 11. The gaps in their stories raised doubts. Cameras added another layer. A traffic camera caught a dark-colored sedan driving through an intersection close to where Michael's car was later found. The vehicle looked identical to the one Malone drove. The timestamp, just after 11 p.m. No license plate could be read. The footage was grainy, but investigators could not ignore the coincidence. For Michael's students, the connection felt chilling. One of them remembered Michael confiding weeks before his disappearance. "If I don't come up with the money, they'll take more than cash." He didn't name anyone, but to those who knew the gambling scene in Raleigh, there was little doubt about who he meant. Malone's reputation filled in the rest. He had a history of using threats and intimidation. Men who couldn't pay disappeared from the gambling tables, their names whispered but never seen again. Police suspected him of being tied to several assaults, but no charges ever stuck. Witnesses went silent. Evidence vanished. So the question grew louder. Was Michael's disappearance a simple debt collection gone too far? Or was it something larger? Some investigators still. The weight of the circumstantial evidence was hard to ignore. Investigators saw a man with resources, money, and connections who could silence someone who threatened his empire. Whether Malone personally touched Michael that night or whether he sent someone else, his shadow hung heavy over the case. The family pushed police to dig deeper into Malone's ties, but the investigation stalled. Detectives admitted later that pressure came from higher up. Malone's reach was wider than expected, stretching into local businesses and possibly even politics. Records disappeared, leads dried up. For the public, Malone became one of the most feared names connected to Michael's disappearance. To this day, many believe he played a role. He had too much to lose if Michael went public, and too much power to be easily caught. The unanswered question still lingers. If Michael was silenced because of his debt and the secrets he carried, why wasn't there more evidence? Did Malone cover his tracks that well? Or did someone else use him as a convenient scapegoat? The story of Malone takes the case out of the personal and into something bigger. This wasn't just about a coach who went missing. It was about a city's underworld, where money, influence, and fear shaped what people said, and what they chose not to say. As one investigator put it years later, Malone had motive, he had the means, and he had the reach. But proving it was another matter entirely. So, where does this leave us? If Daniel Ross had rage and revenge on his side, Malone had something stronger. Money, power, and a criminal network that thrived on silence. And yet, he was not the only person investigators questioned. Another figure stood close to Michael's personal life, a woman who once cared for him, but whose ties to the gambling world may have run deeper than anyone realized. Do you believe Victor Malone's debt and gambling empire sealed Michael's fate? Or was he just another convenient suspect in a city full of secrets? Leave your thoughts below. And stay with us, because next we look at a woman from Michael's past, a relationship that may have been more than personal. That history alone was enough to place her under the spotlight once Michael vanished. But what pushed her deeper into suspicion were whispers about her own connections. People in Raleigh claimed Elena knew men involved in illegal betting. Some even believed she was the one who introduced Michael to those circles when his gym was struggling financially. If true, she may have been the link between Michael's debts and the criminal world that surrounded him. Investigators wanted to know where she was the night of November 19th. Her answer raised more questions than it solved. Elena said she was home the entire evening, but she couldn't provide a single witness to confirm it. No neighbor heard her come or go. No friend recalled speaking with her. Her alibi stood only on her word. And then came the phone. Michael's cell records showed a series of text messages between him and Elena in the days leading up to his disappearance. One of them stood out. It read, "You owe me more than you think." The wording was vague but loaded. What exactly did she mean? Investigators believed it pointed to money. Others suggested it hinted at personal betrayal. Whatever the intention, the timing of the message, just 3 days before Michael was last seen, was impossible to ignore. Witnesses added to the cloud of suspicion. A patron at a local bar near the empty lot where Michael's car was later found swore they saw Elena there the same night. According to the witness, she was sitting at the counter drinking alone and looked upset. But when detectives tried to pull camera footage from the bar, they hit a dead end. The security system had been down that night. The account stood on the memory of a single individual, leaving it unverified, but troubling. The possible motives were clear. Michael and Elena's relationship had not only soured, but it may have tied her into his growing financial troubles. If she had in fact introduced him to the underground gambling scene, she might have feared his potential cooperation with police. If Michael was planning to expose the network, Elena's name could have surfaced in the process. For someone already entangled with dangerous people, that risk could be devastating. There was also physical evidence that pointed her way. Investigators obtained a copy of a taxi log from November 19th. Even without concrete proof, the circumstantial weight pressed down hard. Elena had motive through bitterness and possible financial entanglement. She had opportunity, with an alibi that could not be confirmed. She had unexplained presence near the very location Michael was last linked to. And she had left a cryptic message that hinted at something unresolved between them. Investigators couldn't prove she moved Michael's car or that she was present when he disappeared. But the possibility lingered. Did Elena lure Michael into a meeting that night? Did she serve as a messenger or facilitator for people who wanted him silenced? Or was her only crime being close to him at the wrong point in his life, leaving behind coincidences that looked damning when pieced together later? Her profile in the case reveals the uncertainty investigators often face. Personal relationships blur into financial dealings. A text can mean one thing to a sender and another to an investigator. A single sighting can elevate someone from background figure to prime suspect. Elena became one of those gray areas. A woman once connected to Michael through intimacy now appeared tied to him through suspicion. The trail of evidence around her forced police to consider the possibility that his disappearance wasn't just about deaths or rivalries in the gym. It could have been about betrayal inside his personal life. A betrayal that merged with the same criminal world he was sinking into. Still, the case never produced the proof required to charge her. She denied involvement at every turn. She dismissed the taxi record as a mistake, the bar sighting as false memory, and the text message as a personal comment misread under the weight of tragedy. To this day, her name divides those who study the case. Some believe she was an unfortunate scapegoat. Others remain convinced she knew more than she admitted. And so the question remains: was Elena Cruz only a complicated chapter in Michael's private life? Or was she the dangerous bridge that connected him directly to the criminal network operating in Raleigh? If Elena was just a bridge, then who stood on the other side? The answer didn't come from rumors, or from the lab report lands, and everything shifts. DNA from the steering wheel and driver's seat matches Anthony Vega, 25. He isn't a stranger to Michael. He is the favorite student, the kid Michael called family, the kid he took to tournaments, the kid he vouched for in every gym around Raleigh. That match pulls the case out of rumor and into a hard timeline. The community reels. Coaches say Anthony was loyal. Other fighters say Michael trusted him with keys, with equipment, with late-night rounds after everyone left. That trust now sits beside a cold car in a dirt lot. It forces a simple question. Why is Anthony's DNA in a sedan that turned up abandoned on the night Michael vanished? Detectives rewind the week before the disappearance. They pull phone logs. They list every person who saw Michael inside the gym and outside it. A pattern forms around debt and pressure. Anthony is drowning in sports bets, not boxing but football lines, small slips that grew into stacks. Friends describe loan after loan, some legal, some not. He promises to settle up after a big win. The wins do not come. The calls do. In that same window, several people hear raised voices inside the gym office. One student remembers the words money and stop asking. Another remembers Michael telling someone he couldn't cover it anymore. No threats are heard, but the tone is sharp. The office door is thin. The timing aligns with messages on Anthony's phone about overdue payments. The money trail gets louder on the day Michael disappears. A cash deposit hits an account tied to Anthony. It's large enough to wipe out a month of debt. There is no payroll record for it. There is no invoice. The bank flags nothing because 2003 is a different era. But detectives do. They ask Anthony to explain the source. He can't. He says it was help from a friend. He will not name the friend. The amount sits there, heavy, against a missing coach. Now put the timeline next to the car. Michael leaves the gym at 10:15 p.m., backpack on, moving with purpose. He usually walks or drives toward his apartment. The car is found in a lot in the other direction. The driver's CCTV near the lot is grainy, but there's movement at around midnight. A figure paces near the sedan. The build and height are consistent with Anthony. The video can't lock an ID, but the outline is familiar to anyone who watched him hit mitts. Long reach, rounded shoulders from years of hooks. He stands by the trunk, then the driver's door, then steps out of frame. 30 seconds later, the car's interior dome light flashes and dies. The next time anyone touches the car, Police are breaking the seal. Anthony's first interview is short. He says he borrowed the car a few days before to practice. He says he hasn't been near it since. Detectives ask about the seat. He shrugs. They ask about the deposit. He shrugs again. They ask where he was on the night of the 19th. He says at home, then with a friend, then back home. The friend contradicts the story. Phone pings show his device traveled within a mile of the dirt lot near midnight. He says he lent the phone out. To who? He can't remember. Another detail slides into place. Michael's backpack is missing. His gloves are missing. Papers he often carried are missing. Students say he kept a small folder of receipts and names. It wasn't gym bookkeeping. It looked like notes. He told one kid, "I need these to make something right." If those papers included contacts tied to betting, they were valuable to anyone who owed or anyone who paid. The argument in the office now matters more. Anthony had asked Michael for help with a debt. Michael promised to try. He asked for time. He didn't have the money. People who loan to fighters don't like time. If Anthony faced a deadline, he might have needed a quick solution. He could have pressured Michael to meet someone. He could have offered to drive. He could have set a meeting that never made it to paper. But the car tells a narrower story. Someone other than Michael sat behind that wheel late that night. Someone who left the key in the column and walked away. There are no signs of a fight inside. No glass, no blood, no drag marks softening the dirt. That suggests a handoff. Park the car. Stage the scene. Let the empty space do the rest. If Anthony wasn't acting alone, he could have been the courier. Move the car. Friends plead his case. They say he loved Michael. They say he wouldn't hurt him. Maybe that's true. The investigation doesn't need love or hate to explain a night like this. It needs debt, fear, and a deadline. If someone in the gambling world wanted Michael quiet, Anthony could have been pushed, tricked, or bought. A student can be loyal and still make a catastrophic decision under pressure. It happens fast. It happens in minutes. It leaves a car with a key and a story with holes. So the twist lands with weight. This isn't just a feud with a bitter ex-fighter. It isn't just a ruthless lender guarding his business. It is money connecting the gym to the street. It is a trusted student tied to a staged vehicle and a vanished coach. It is a cold case that stops being simple the moment Anthony's name hits the lab sheet. Where does that leave the search? With a clear fork. Either Anthony acted on his own in a desperate move tied to cash, or he acted as a link for people who had more to lose than he did. The first option points to a split-second plan. The second points to a network with reach, transportation, and practice. Neither option brings Michael home. Both explain the silence that followed. As the file thickens, the public wants certainty. Detectives want a body, a witness, or a confession. They do not get any of those. What they do have is this: Anthony Vega's DNA inside the driver's space, a deposit that doesn't make sense, a midnight shape that matches his frame, and a coach who stepped into the dark and never returned. That is the core. That is the twist that drags the case forward, even years later. In the following chapter of this case, the focus turns to fallout and legacy. A gym closes. A town picks sides. Names in the margins of a notebook start to appear in headlines. If you see a detail we missed, call it out. If you think Anthony was a pawn or a planner, say why. Your read on the evidence may be the pressure this cold case still needs. Years passed, but Michael Torres was never found. His body never recovered. His fate never confirmed. For his family, every day was a balance between fragile hope and constant doubt. Each police update ended the same way. No conclusive evidence. No final answer. His relatives said in frustration, "We just want to know where he is." The waiting became its own kind of torment. Birthdays, holidays, and anniversaries passed with an empty chair at the table. Hope slowly gave way to silence. What remained was not closure, but a wound that never healed. The boxing gym he built, his pride, his mission, lasted only a few months after his disappearance. Without Michael, the doors closed. The walls that once echoed with gloves striking bags, with shouts of encouragement, with sweat and discipline, fell quiet. Many of the young fighters who once saw the gym as their way out scattered. A few drifted back into gangs. Others walked away from boxing forever. The place that had saved lives crumbled without the man who held it together. The community reacted in its own way. Local papers covered the story relentlessly. Residents of Raleigh whispered about debts, underground gambling, and the dark connections between sports and crime. Michael's name became more than a missing person case. He became a symbol, both tragic and respected, of what happens when one man stands too close to dangerous forces. The investigation circled the same 4 names but reached no conclusion. Daniel Ross, the former student whose career ended in disgrace, was questioned repeatedly. His anger toward Michael was well known. His alibi was weak. But there was never enough evidence to connect him directly to the night Michael vanished. Victor Malone, the gambling boss, carried the clearest motive: money, debt, and silence. Police connected his phone to Michael's in the days before the disappearance. Witnesses saw him in tense meetings with Michael. Yet Malone remained free, only ever charged for minor offenses. His empire continued. Elena Cruz, once Michael's lover, left Raleigh shortly after his disappearance. She denied any role in what happened, but unanswered questions about her ties to local gamblers lingered. The cryptic text she sent Michael before he vanished, "You owe me more than you think," remained a haunting clue without context. And Anthony Vega, the loyal protégé, carried the heaviest shadow. His DNA inside Michael's car, his massive debts, the suspicious deposit of cash on the very day Michael disappeared. Witnesses remembered heated arguments about money in the gym. Yet even with so much suspicion, prosecutors never secured enough to make a case. Anthony lived under the cloud of doubt, but not behind bars. The case did not close doors. It opened them. Investigators dug into other files: illegal debts, money laundering, underground betting rings across North Carolina. Arrests were made. Networks were exposed. But the real power players behind the gambling economy stayed out of reach. And the man who sparked the investigation, Michael Torres, was still gone. In police training courses, his case became a lesson in cold case investigation, a warning about the importance of preserving evidence, a reminder of how gambling and organized crime bleed into local communities. Michael's name was repeated not just in newsrooms, but in classrooms for future detectives. But for the fighters who trained under him, the legacy was personal. His photo still hung on the wall of the shuttered gym. For many, he was the man who gave them a second chance. Some of those young men years later admitted, "If it wasn't for Michael, I wouldn't be alive today." Every year, people gathered at the site of the old gym. They lit candles, set a pair of worn boxing gloves in the center, and placed a sign that read, "Coach missing. Crime ties revealed." It was not just an act of mourning. It was a reminder that justice had never come. The impact stretched beyond one missing coach. His story became a symbol of hidden truths in sports and crime. It forced law enforcement to face questions about accountability and transparency. It pushed the community to acknowledge the cost of silence. For Raleigh's boxing world, Michael was remembered as more than a trainer. He was remembered as a victim of a darker game, one where debts, secrets, and betrayal outweighed loyalty. This was not only the story of a man who vanished. It was the story of trust broken, of betrayal carried out, of money that destroyed lives. Michael disappeared, but the questions about justice remain. Who silenced him? Who gained from his disappearance? And how long will the truth stay buried? Because until answers come, the legacy of Michael Torres is unfinished.